The galaxy had been at peace for nearly 12,000 years. The great civilizations of the Milky Way had built their empires across thousands of star systems, connected by trade routes that stretched like invisible threads through the darkness of space. The Velthari, tall and graceful beings with skin that shifted colors like oil on water, controlled most of the galactic core. They were the oldest known civilization still active in the galaxy, and their wisdom was respected by every species that had ever reached the stars. Their cities floated above the surfaces of gas giants, harvesting energy from storms that had raged for millions of years. Their technology was so advanced that younger species often mistook it for magic. They could bend light around their ships, making them invisible to any sensor. They could grow buildings from living crystal that repaired itself when damaged. They had even learned to slow down time inside their medical chambers, giving their doctors hours to perform surgeries that would have taken seconds in normal space. Next to the Velthari in terms of power and influence were the Draconith, a reptilian species that stood nearly 3 meters tall and had scales harder than most metals found in nature. The Draconith were warriors by tradition, but they had long ago put aside their aggressive ways in favor of diplomacy and trade. Their homeworld, a harsh desert planet orbiting a red dwarf star, had forged them into survivors. They could go weeks without water, could see in almost total darkness, and their bodies could heal from wounds that would kill most other species. Their military fleet was the largest in the galaxy, but it had not fired a shot in anger for over 2,000 years. Instead, the Draconith served as peacekeepers, patrolling the borders between civilizations and making sure that old grudges did not turn into new wars. The Luminari were perhaps the most beautiful species in the known galaxy. They were beings of living light, their bodies made of energy contained within thin crystalline shells. They communicated through pulses of color and sound that could carry more information in a single flash than most species could convey in an hour of talking. The Luminari were scientists and artists, and their understanding of physics was unmatched. They had mapped the structure of space-time itself, discovering patterns and connections that other species had never even imagined. Their contribution to galactic civilization was knowledge, and their great libraries contained the collected wisdom of every species that had ever joined the galactic community. Then there were the Thessarai, an insectoid species that lived in vast underground colonies beneath the frozen surfaces of ice worlds. Each Thessarai colony functioned as a single organism, with millions of individual bodies sharing one collective consciousness. They were builders and engineers without equal. The megastructures they constructed, orbital rings and space elevators, and artificial worlds, were marvels that drew visitors from across the galaxy. The Thessarai did not think the way other species did. They did not have individual desires or ambitions. Instead, they worked together with a unity of purpose that allowed them to accomplish things that would have been impossible for any other species. And finally, there were the humans. They were the youngest species in the galactic community, having only achieved faster-than-light travel a mere 300 years ago. Compared to the ancient civilizations around them, humans were practically newborns. Their technology was crude. Their understanding of the universe was limited, and their lifespans were embarrassingly short. A human might live for 120 years if they were lucky, while a Velthari could live for 10,000 and a Luminari might exist for even longer. The other species regarded humans with a mixture of curiosity and mild condescension. They were interesting, these small, soft, fragile creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. They had a certain energy about them, a restlessness that the older species found both amusing and slightly concerning. But no one took them seriously as a galactic power. They were too young, too weak, too limited. The Galactic Council met once every standard year on the great station called the Nexus, a massive structure that orbited a neutron star at the very center of the galaxy. The Nexus was neutral ground, a place where all species were equal, regardless of the size of their empires or the strength of their fleets. The council chamber itself was enormous, a dome of transparent material that allowed the representatives to look out at the swirling accretion disk of the neutron star while they debated matters of galactic importance. The representatives sat in a circle, each delegation occupying a section of the chamber that had been designed to accommodate their particular biology. The Velthari section was filled with a thin mist that kept their color-shifting skin comfortable. The Draconith section was heated to the scorching temperatures they preferred. The Luminari section was darkened so that their light bodies could be seen clearly. The Thessaly section contained a small piece of their collective, enough individual bodies to maintain a functioning group mind. And the human section was, by galactic standards, remarkably plain. Just chairs, a table, and a coffee machine that the human ambassador had insisted on bringing from Earth. Ambassador Sarah Chen was the human representative to the Galactic Council, and she had held the position for 15 years. She was a small woman by human standards, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair that was beginning to show streaks of gray and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had earned her position not through political connections or family wealth, but through sheer determination and a mind that could cut through complexity like a laser through fog. The other ambassadors had learned to respect her, even if they did not always take humanity seriously. Chen had a way of asking questions that exposed weaknesses in arguments, and she never backed down from a debate even when she was outnumbered. On this particular day, the council session had been going on for 6 hours, and Chen was tired. The Velthari ambassador, a being called Solmeth, who was over 4,000 years old, had been giving a presentation about trade regulations that was technically fascinating, but practically endless. Chen was on her 3rd cup of coffee and considering a 4th when something happened that changed everything. The lights in the council chamber flickered. This was unusual because the Nexus was powered by the neutron star itself, and its power systems had never failed in the 8,000 years since the station had been built. Every ambassador in the chamber looked up startled. Then the main communication screen at the center of the dome activated on its own, overriding the trade presentation and replacing it with something that made Chen's blood run cold. It was a star chart, but it was not a normal star chart. This one showed a region of space on the outer edge of the galaxy, and in that region, stars were going dark. Not dimming, not flickering, but going completely and utterly dark, as if something was swallowing them whole. The chart was animated, showing a time-lapse that covered the last 6 months, and as the ambassadors watched, they could see the darkness spreading inward, consuming star after star in a wave of extinction that was moving toward the galactic core. The chamber erupted in chaos. The Draconith ambassador, a massive warrior named Krethos, stood up so fast that his chair shattered behind him. The Luminari delegation pulsed with colors that Chen had learned to recognize as extreme distress. The Thessaly collective buzzed with a sound like 1,000 angry wasps. Only Solmeth remained calm, his skin shifting to a pale, steady blue that indicated deep thought. Chen stood up and walked to the center of the chamber, ignoring the protocols that said she should wait for permission to speak. She pointed at the star chart and spoke in a voice that carried across the room despite her small size. She asked what they were looking at and whether anyone had data on this phenomenon. Solmeth answered first, his voice like silk over gravel. He said that the Velthari had been monitoring the situation for 3 months, but had been unable to determine the cause. Their most advanced sensors could detect nothing in the affected regions. No energy signatures, no gravitational anomalies, no electromagnetic emissions. The stars were simply ceasing to exist. Krethos growled, his massive clawed hands gripping the railing in front of him. He demanded to know why the Velthari had not shared this information with the Council sooner. 3 months was a long time to keep something this important secret. Solmeth's skin shifted to a defensive orange. He explained that the Velthari had not wanted to cause panic before they understood what they were dealing with. He admitted now that this had been a mistake. Chen studied the star chart carefully. She was not a scientist, but she understood maps, and what this map was telling her was terrifying. The wave of darkness was not random. It was moving in a pattern, a spiral, that was curving inward toward the more densely populated regions of the galaxy. At its current speed, it would reach the first major civilization within 2 years. Within 5 years, it would reach the galactic core. Within 10 years, there would be nothing left. She asked how many inhabited worlds were in the path of the wave. The answer came from the Luminari delegation, their light pulsing in patterns that the translation system converted to speech. They said that based on current projections, over 400 billion sentient beings were in direct danger. If the wave could not be stopped, every civilization in the galaxy would be destroyed. The chamber fell silent. 400 billion lives. It was a number so large that it was almost meaningless. Chen felt her hands trembling and gripped the railing to steady them. She had come to this council meeting expecting to argue about trade regulations and shipping lanes. Instead, she was looking at the end of everything. Over the next several days, the council organized an emergency response. The Velthari shared all of their data on the phenomenon, which the scientists began calling the void wave. The Luminari deployed their most advanced sensors to the edge of the affected region, trying to understand what was causing stars to disappear. The Draconith mobilized their fleet, though no one was sure what a military response could accomplish against something that ate stars. The Thessari began designing evacuation ships, calculating how many beings could be moved and how quickly. And the humans offered to help in whatever way they could. Their offer was accepted politely but without much enthusiasm. What could the youngest species in the galaxy possibly contribute to a crisis of this magnitude? Their technology was primitive, their resources were limited, and their understanding of advanced physics was elementary compared to the older species. The Velthari thanked them for their willingness, but suggested that perhaps the humans should focus on evacuating their own worlds, which were relatively close to the approaching wave. Chen did not argue. She smiled, thanked the Velthari for their concern, and then quietly contacted Earth. She spoke with the Secretary General of the United Earth Government, a man named James Okafor, and told him everything. Okafor listened without interrupting, which Chen had always appreciated about him. When she finished, he asked her a single question. He asked what she needed. Chen told him she needed everything. Every scientist, every engineer, every pilot, every ship. She needed the full resources of humanity directed at this problem, and she needed them now. Okafor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Chen would remember for the rest of her life. He said that humans had been told their whole lives that they were too young, too small, too fragile to matter in the galaxy. He said that maybe it was time to show the galaxy what being young and small and fragile had taught the human species. It had taught them to fight. Within a week, humanity began to mobilize. It was not a military mobilization, though. Military ships were involved. It was something larger, something that the other species had never seen before. Every university on every human world redirected its research toward the void wave. Every shipyard began building sensor probes and scout vessels. Every military academy began training pilots for deep space missions into the unknown. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Not just soldiers, but scientists, engineers, doctors, teachers, artists, anyone who thought they could contribute something. The other species watched this with bemusement. The humans were certainly enthusiastic, but enthusiasm could not stop a force that devoured stars. The Velthari continued their measured analysis. The Luminari continued their sensor sweeps. The Draconith continued their fleet patrols. Everyone was doing something, but no one knew if anything would work. Chen spent her days in the council chamber, participating in strategy sessions that lasted 12 or 14 hours. She spent her nights reading reports from human research teams, looking for any insight that might have been overlooked. She slept 3 or 4 hours a night and sustained herself on coffee and determination. She knew that humanity's contribution might amount to nothing. She knew that the other species had millennia of scientific knowledge that humans could not hope to match. But she also knew something that the other species seemed to have forgotten, something that their long lives and advanced technology had dulled in them. She knew what it felt like to be afraid. Not the abstract intellectual fear that came from understanding a threat, but the deep, primal, gut-level terror that came from knowing you were small and fragile, and that the universe did not care whether you lived or died. Humans lived with that fear every day of their short lives, and it had shaped them in ways that the older species could not understand. It had made them desperate and creative and stubborn and brave. It had taught them that the only response to impossible odds was to try anyway. 3 weeks after the emergency council session, the first human scout ships reached the edge of the void wave. They were small vessels, crewed by teams of 3, equipped with the best sensors humanity could build. They were not as advanced as Valthari technology, or as sensitive as Luminari equipment. But they had one advantage that the other species' sensors did not have. They had humans operating them. Humans who were willing to fly closer to the void wave than any automated probe had been sent. Humans who were willing to take risks that the safety protocols of older civilizations would never have allowed. The first scout ship to enter the affected region was the ESS Magellan, crewed by Captain Diego Reyes, Science Officer Dr. Yuki Tanaka, and Engineer Specialist Marcus Webb. They were young. The oldest of them was 34, and they knew that their mission might be one way. They had volunteered anyway. As the Magellan crossed into the region where stars had gone dark, Tanaka noticed something that none of the remote sensors had detected. There was not nothing in the void. There was something so vast and so strange that normal sensors could not register it. It was not matter and it was not energy. At least not any form of matter or energy that galactic science had catalogued. It was something else entirely. Something that existed in a state between existence and non-existence, flickering in and out of reality like a candle flame in a wind that blew from nowhere. Tanaka stared at her readings, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She was not a genius by Luminari standards. She was not ancient and wise like a Valthari scientist. She was a 31-year-old astrophysicist from Kyoto who had graduated in the middle of her class and had taken this mission because she believed that even ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. She transmitted her findings back to Earth, to the Nexus, to anyone who would listen. And what she had found changed everything. The void wave was not a natural phenomenon. It was not a cosmic event or a shift in the fundamental forces of the universe. It was alive. Something was out there in the darkness between galaxies. Something ancient and vast and hungry, and it was eating its way toward the heart of the Milky Way. The galaxy was not facing a disaster. It was facing an invasion. And nobody, not the ancient Valthari, not the mighty Draconith, not the brilliant Luminari, not the industrious Theseri, nobody had any idea how to stop it. Nobody except, perhaps, the youngest and most fragile species in the galaxy. The ones who had spent their entire history fighting things bigger and stronger than themselves. The ones who had never learned to accept defeat because their lives were too short to waste on giving up. The humans. The news that the void wave was alive spread through the galactic community like fire through dry grass. Within hours of Dr. Tanaka's transmission, every major news network on every civilized world was broadcasting the same terrifying message. Something was coming. Something was hungry. And it was already inside the galaxy. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. On the Valthari homeworld, the great floating cities dimmed their lights for the first time in recorded history as the population processed the news in collective meditation. The Valthari way of dealing with crisis was through contemplation and careful thought, and their leaders urged calm while scientists worked to verify the human findings. On the Draconith worlds, the reaction was very different. Warriors who had not drawn their weapons in centuries began sharpening their blades. Fleet commanders recalled every patrol ship and began forming battle groups. The Draconith had always believed that any problem could be solved through sufficient force, and they intended to prove it. The Luminari retreated into their libraries, searching through millions of years of accumulated knowledge for any reference to something like the void wave. They found nothing. Whatever this thing was, it was beyond the experience of every civilization that had ever existed in the galaxy. The Thessaly, practical as always, simply accelerated their evacuation ship construction, their collective minds calculating odds of survival with cold precision. And on Earth, humanity did what humanity had always done when faced with extinction. They argued about it. The United Earth Parliament was in continuous session, and the debates were fierce. Some representatives wanted to focus all resources on defense, building weapons and fortifications. Others wanted to pour everything into research, understanding the enemy before trying to fight it. A third faction wanted immediate evacuation, moving the entire human population to the far side of the galaxy and hoping that distance would provide safety. The arguments went back and forth for days, tempers flaring and alliances shifting with every new piece of information that came in from the scout ships. Secretary General Okafor let the debate rage for exactly 1 week. Then he stood up in the Parliament chamber and spoke for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound the podium. He simply laid out the facts as he understood them. He told them that evacuation was not an option because the void wave was moving in every direction. There was nowhere in the galaxy to hide. He told them that pure research would take too long because at the rate the wave was advancing, they had perhaps 18 months before it reached the first major population centers. He told them that a purely military response was foolish because they did not yet understand what they were fighting. And then he told them what he thought they should do. He said they should do everything. All of it. Research, and weapons, and defense, and scouting, and diplomacy, and evacuation planning, all at the same time. He said that humanity's greatest strength had never been its ability to focus on one thing. It was the ability to do 100 things at once, badly at first, and then better, and then well enough. He said they did not have the luxury of choosing the right approach because they did not know what the right approach was. So they would try every approach and see what worked. The Parliament voted. The result was nearly unanimous. Humanity committed itself fully to the fight against the void wave, and within days, the machinery of an entire species shifted into a gear that it had not used since the last Great War on Earth over 400 years ago. Meanwhile, on the Nexus station, Ambassador Chen was fighting a different kind of battle. The Galactic Council was paralyzed. The Velthari wanted more data before making any decisions. The Draconith wanted to attack immediately. The Luminari wanted to study the phenomenon from a safe distance. The Thessaly wanted to begin systematic evacuation of the most threatened worlds. Every species had its own approach, and none of them were willing to compromise. Chen sat through meeting after meeting, listening to the same arguments repeated in different ways. She understood the problem. These were ancient civilizations with deeply ingrained ways of thinking. The Velthari had survived for 12,000 years by being cautious and methodical. The Draconith had survived by being strong. The Luminari had survived by being smart. The Thessaly had survived by being efficient. None of them knew how to be all of these things at once, and none of them were willing to admit that their approach alone might not be enough. On the 9th day of deadlock, Chen did something that no human ambassador had ever done. She invoked the right of direct address, an ancient protocol that allowed any species to speak to the full council without interruption. It was rarely used because it was considered slightly rude, almost aggressive, to demand the undivided attention of every ambassador in the chamber. Chen did not care about being rude. She cared about the 400 billion lives that were counting down toward extinction. She stood in the center of the chamber, looking up at the representatives of species that were older, wiser, stronger, and more advanced than humanity in every measurable way, and she told them the truth. She told them that they were all right and they were all wrong. The Velthari were right that they needed more data, but wrong to wait for complete understanding before acting. The Draconith were right that they needed military readiness, but wrong to think that brute force alone could stop something that ate stars. The Luminari were right that knowledge was the key, but wrong to study from a distance when every day of delay meant more stars consumed. The Thessari were right that evacuation should begin, but wrong to treat it as the primary strategy when there was nowhere to evacuate to. She told them that humanity had a saying that came from one of their oldest stories. She said that the only way to eat an elephant was one bite at a time. The other ambassadors did not understand the reference, as most of them had never seen an elephant, but they understood the principle. The problem was too big for any single approach. They needed all approaches running simultaneously, feeding information to each other in real time. She proposed the creation of a joint operations center, staffed by members of every species, coordinated by a command structure that could make decisions quickly, without waiting for consensus. She proposed that the Velthari lead the research effort. The Draconeth lead the military preparation. The Luminari manage the intelligence gathering. The Thessari handle logistics and evacuation, and the humans serve as coordinators, bridging the gaps between the different approaches and making sure that information flowed freely between all teams. Salmeth asked why humans should coordinate. It was a fair question. Humans were the youngest, the least experienced, the least knowledgeable. Why should they be trusted with such a critical role? Chen answered without hesitation. She said it was because humans were the only species in the room that was used to being bad at things. She said that every other species had thousands of years of experience doing what they did best. Humans had 300 years of experience being the worst at everything in the galaxy, and that had taught them something valuable. It had taught them how to learn fast, how to adapt, how to take ideas from different sources and combine them into something new. Humans were not specialists. They were generalists. And what the galaxy needed right now was not a specialist solution to one aspect of the problem. It needed a generalist approach that could tie everything together. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then, Krethos, the Draconeth ambassador, did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that shook the floor, and when he spoke, his voice was warm with something that might have been admiration. He said that the little human had courage. He said that courage was worth more than experience in times like these. He voted yes. The Thessari collective buzzed agreement. The Luminari pulsed in colors that meant cautious approval. Even Solmeth, after a long pause during which his skin cycled through a dozen colors, finally settled on a deep green that meant acceptance. The Joint Operations Center was established on the Nexus within 48 hours. It was a massive room that had been converted from a cargo bay, filled with equipment from every species. Velthari holographic displays hung in the air next to human computer screens. Draconeth tactical maps covered the walls beside Luminari data crystals. Thessari engineering stations hummed next to human workbenches cluttered with coffee cups and handwritten notes. Chen put Captain Elena Vasquez in charge of the human coordination team. Vasquez was a former military officer turned diplomat, a woman who had the rare ability to understand how different minds thought and to find common ground between people who believed they had nothing in common. She was also possibly the most stubborn person Chen had ever met, which was saying something given that Chen was herself quite stubborn. Vasquez dove into her work with the kind of intensity that made the other species nervous. She worked 20-hour days moving between the different species teams, learning their methods, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and slowly, carefully building bridges between them. It was not easy. The Velthari researchers did not want to share preliminary findings because in their culture, presenting unverified data was considered shameful. Vasquez convinced them that in a crisis, even unverified data could save lives. The Draconeth military planners did not want to coordinate with civilians because their warrior code drew a sharp line between soldiers and everyone else. Vasquez showed them that the skills they needed, engineering, science, logistics, could only come from outside the military. The Luminari were reluctant to let other species access their sensor data because they worried about the information being misinterpreted by less advanced minds. Vasquez assigned human translators to work alongside Luminari analysts, creating a bridge between alien brilliance and practical application. While the Joint Operations Center was being organized, the scout missions continued. The ESS Magellan and 17 other human scout ships were operating deep inside the void wave, gathering data that no remote sensor could collect. They were taking enormous risks. 2 ships had already been lost: the ESS Drake and the ESS Shackleton, vanishing without a trace after sending back garbled transmissions about something approaching them in the darkness. The crews of the remaining ships knew that every mission might be their last, but none of them asked to be recalled. Captain Reyes and his crew on the Magellan had become the most experienced team in the void, having completed 7 deep penetration missions in the weeks since their first discovery. Dr. Tanaka had refined her detection methods, developing a way to track the living entity within the void wave by measuring fluctuations in the quantum foam, the tiny bubbles of energy that popped in and out of existence at the subatomic level. In normal space, these fluctuations were random. Inside the void wave, they were organized, as if something was using them as a circulatory system. On their 8th mission, the Magellan went deeper than any ship had gone before. They crossed a threshold that Tanaka called the event boundary, the point beyond which the stars were not just dimmed but completely erased from existence. Beyond this boundary, the universe itself seemed different. The laws of physics still worked, but they felt stretched, like fabric pulled too tight. Light behaved strangely, bending in directions that should have been impossible. Time seemed to stutter, jumping forward in small increments as if the clock was skipping beats. Marcus Webb, the engineer, kept the ship running through sheer willpower and creative problem-solving. Systems that were designed to operate in normal space kept malfunctioning in the altered physics of the void, and Webb spent most of his time crawling through access panels, rerouting power and jury-rigging solutions that would have horrified any proper engineer. He was not brilliant. He was not an innovator. He was a man who understood machines at a level that went beyond textbooks. A man who could feel when something was wrong with a ship the way a doctor could feel a patient's pulse and know their condition. It was Webb who made the next critical discovery. While repairing a damaged sensor array, he noticed that the ship's hull was vibrating at a frequency that did not correspond to any of the Magellan systems. The vibration was coming from outside, from the void itself. He recorded it and sent it to Tanaka, who analyzed it and went pale. The vibration was a signal, not random noise, not a natural phenomenon, but a structured, repeating pattern that carried information. The entity in the void was not just alive. It was communicating. And it was communicating with something ahead of it. Deeper in the galaxy, something that was already there, already waiting. Tanaka transmitted her findings to the Joint Operations Center, and the effect was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread outward, touching every team, every species, every plan. The void wave was not just an approaching threat. It was part of a coordinated action. There was something already inside the galaxy, something that had been there for who knew how long, and it was in contact with the approaching entity. The question was no longer just how to stop the void wave. The question was, what was it talking to? And what were they planning? Vasquez called an emergency meeting of all team leaders. The room was tense, the air thick with the combined stress of a dozen species facing a threat that had just become much more complicated. Vasquez stood at the central display, showing the signal that Webb had detected alongside a map of the galaxy. She asked the Luminari intelligence team if they could trace the signal to its destination. The Luminari chief analyst, a being whose name translated roughly as Bright Echo, pulsed a complex pattern that meant uncertainty mixed with determination. Bright Echo explained that the signal used a form of communication that the Luminari had never encountered, one that seemed to bypass normal space-time entirely. Tracing it would require developing entirely new detection methods, which could take months. A human analyst named David Kim, a young man who had been assigned to work with the Luminari team, raised his hand. He said that they might not need to trace the signal if they could decode it instead. If they could understand what the entity was saying, they might be able to figure out who it was talking to based on the content of the message. Bright Echo considered this. In Luminari culture, eavesdropping on private communications was considered deeply unethical. But this was not a private conversation between individuals. This was a hostile entity coordinating an attack on the galaxy. Bright Echo agreed to try. The decoding effort became one of the most remarkable collaborations in galactic history. Luminari cryptographers worked alongside human linguists, Velthari pattern recognition specialists, and Thessari computational experts. Each species brought a different perspective to the problem. The Luminari understood the physics of the signal. The Velthari could identify patterns across enormous datasets. The Thessari could process calculations at incredible speed through their collective mind. And the humans brought something that none of the other species could provide. They brought imagination. It was a human linguist named Amara Osei who made the breakthrough. She had been studying the signal for 3 days straight, surviving on caffeine and determination, when she noticed something that the more sophisticated alien analysts had missed. The signal was not a language in the traditional sense. It was not words or symbols or mathematical formulas. It was emotions. Raw, unfiltered emotional content, transmitted in a form that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the most primitive part of any conscious mind. And the emotion it was transmitting was hunger, not physical hunger, not the need for food or energy, but a deeper, more existential hunger. A hunger for existence itself. The entity in the void was not consuming stars for fuel. It was consuming them for meaning. Each star it devoured added to its consciousness, expanded its awareness, fed a need for being that was as fundamental to it as breathing was to a human. Osei presented her findings to the Joint Operations Center, and for the first time, the assembled representatives of 5 civilizations understood what they were truly facing. This was not an invasion in any conventional sense. This was a being so vast and so ancient that entire galaxies were food to it, and it was not attacking the Milky Way. It was eating it, slowly, methodically, inevitably. And the signal it was sending ahead was not a message to an ally. It was a message to a part of itself, a piece of its consciousness that had arrived in the galaxy long ago, embedding itself in the fabric of space-time, preparing the way for the main body to follow. The entity was not just outside the galaxy, it was already inside it, woven into the structure of reality itself, and it had been there for longer than any civilization had existed. The silence in the Joint Operations Center lasted for nearly a minute. Then Ambassador Chen, who had been listening from her position in the observation gallery, spoke up. She said something that none of the ancient, wise, powerful species in the room had been willing to say. She said that they were not just fighting for their civilizations. They were fighting for the right to exist. And she said that if there was one thing humans understood, it was how to fight for the right to exist when everything in the universe seemed determined to take that right away. She looked at each ambassador in turn, her small human eyes meeting the vast, ancient gazes of beings who had existed for millennia, and she asked them a question that was so simple it was almost childish. She asked them if they were willing to fight for their lives. One by one, they answered. Krethos slammed his fist against his chest in the draconith gesture of commitment to battle. Bright Echo pulsed a brilliant white that meant absolute resolve. The Thessari collective hummed in perfect unison, a sound that meant total agreement. And Salmeth, the ancient Velthari who had seen more of the galaxy's history than anyone else in the room, changed his skin to a color that no human had ever seen before, a deep, burning gold that meant something so sacred in Velthari culture that it had not been used in over 1,000 years. It meant defiance. Defiance in the face of certain destruction. Defiance of the universe itself. The galaxy was going to fight, and the youngest, weakest, most fragile species in it was going to lead the way. The war against the void entity, as it came to be called, began not with weapons but with understanding. The Joint Operations Center became the beating heart of the galactic resistance, and under Vasquez's coordination, the different species teams began to produce results at a pace that surprised even the most optimistic observers. But understanding came at a cost, and the cost was measured in lives. The scout fleet had grown from 18 ships to over 100, crewed by volunteers from every species but primarily staffed by humans. The reason for this was simple and uncomfortable. Humans were better at surviving in the void than anyone else, not because they were tougher or smarter or better equipped, but because they adapted faster. When the altered physics of the void caused equipment to malfunction, human crews improvised solutions in minutes that took other species hours. When the psychological pressure of operating in a place where reality itself felt wrong began to break down the minds of the crews, humans lasted longer before cracking. Not because they were stronger mentally, but because they were used to living with fear. For a species whose entire evolutionary history had been shaped by the knowledge of their own mortality, the existential dread of the void was terrifying but not paralyzing. Humans had been staring into the abyss their entire existence. The abyss staring back was new, but the act of staring was not. Captain Reyes and the crew of the Magellan had become legends within the fleet. They had completed 14 missions into the void, more than any other crew, and each mission had brought back data that advanced the galactic understanding of the enemy. Reyes himself had changed in the months since his first mission. The young, eager captain who had volunteered for a one-way trip had become a quiet, intense man who spoke rarely but whose words carried the weight of someone who had seen things that could not be unseen. His crew had changed too. Tanaka had developed a kind of sixth sense for the void, an intuitive understanding of its patterns that went beyond her scientific training. Webb had become so skilled at keeping ships running in impossible conditions that other crews called him the miracle worker. On their 15th mission, the Magellan went deeper into the void than any ship had ever gone before. They were searching for the embedded consciousness, the part of the entity that had been inside the galaxy since before any civilization arose. The signal analysis team, led by Amara Osei, had narrowed down the likely location of the embedded consciousness to a region near the galactic core, close to a cluster of ancient stars that had been burning since the galaxy was young. If they could find it, if they could understand how it connected to the main body of the entity, they might find a way to sever that connection and slow or stop the advance of the void wave. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of flying through space that did not behave the way space was supposed to behave, where distances shifted and time stuttered, and the stars outside the viewport seemed to whisper in a language that was almost but not quite comprehensible. Webb kept the ship running. Tanaka kept the sensors working. Reyes kept them alive. On the 18th day, they found it. It was not what any of them had expected. They had imagined something physical, a structure or an object, or a concentration of exotic matter. Instead, what they found was a pattern, a vast, intricate pattern woven into the fabric of space-time itself, stretching across light years, threading through the gravitational fields of ancient stars like a spiderweb spun through a forest. The pattern was invisible to normal sensors. Even Luminari equipment could not detect it directly. But Tanaka's quantum foam detection method could see its edges, the places where the pattern interacted with the subatomic structure of reality. The pattern was alive, in the same way that the void wave was alive. It pulsed with a slow rhythm that matched the signal the entity was sending from outside the galaxy. It was breathing, Tanaka said, and Reyes felt his skin crawl at the thought of something so vast that its breaths spanned light years. Tanaka mapped as much of the pattern as she could, which was only a tiny fraction of the whole. But even that tiny fraction contained more information than the entire Joint Operations Center had gathered in weeks of effort. She found that the pattern was not just sitting in space-time. It was changing space-time, subtly altering the fundamental constants of physics in ways that would make the region more hospitable to the entity when it arrived. It was terraforming the galaxy, not the surfaces of planets but the structure of reality itself, preparing it to be consumed. She also found something else, something that gave them the first real hope they had felt since the crisis began. The pattern had weak points, places where the threads of the web were thin, where the connections between different parts of the pattern were fragile. If those connections could be disrupted, the pattern might unravel, at least partially. And if the pattern unraveled, the entity would lose its foothold inside the galaxy. It would still be coming, still hungry, still vast beyond comprehension, but it would be coming blind, without the advanced preparation that the embedded consciousness provided. The Magellan transmitted its findings and turned for home. They made it back to friendly space with their fuel cells nearly empty and their hulls scarred by the strange energies of the void. When they docked at the Nexus, the entire station turned out to welcome them. Reyes walked off his ship on legs that trembled with exhaustion, and he found Ambassador Chen waiting for him on the dock. She told him that what his crew had found might save the galaxy. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said he hoped so, because he did not think his crew could go back in there again. They had reached their limit. Even humans had limits. Chen put her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that was meaningless in most alien cultures, but that Reyes understood perfectly. She told him that he had done enough, more than enough. Now it was someone else's turn. The data from the Magellan's 15th mission transformed the resistance effort. For the first time, they had a target. Or rather, they had many targets. The weak points in the embedded pattern became the focus of a massive planning effort that brought together the best minds of every species. The Luminary scientists analyzed the pattern and confirmed Tanaka's findings. The weak points were real, and they were vulnerable, but disrupting them would require an enormous amount of precisely directed energy, applied at exactly the right frequencies and at exactly the right locations across a vast region of space. It was not enough to hit one weak point. They needed to hit hundreds of them simultaneously, or the pattern would simply reroute around the damage and repair itself. The Draconith military commanders designed the attack plan. It was the largest military operation in galactic history, requiring thousands of ships positioned across hundreds of light years, all firing at precisely coordinated moments. The logistics were staggering. The distances involved meant that communication delays would make real-time coordination impossible. Every ship would need to know exactly what to do and exactly when to do it, with no room for error. The Thessary engineers built the weapons. Normal energy weapons would not work against the pattern because it existed at the quantum level, below the scale where conventional physics operated. The Thessary designed a new type of weapon that could project energy at the quantum scale, disrupting the very fabric of space-time at the points where the pattern was weakest. They called them resonance disruptors, and each one was a masterpiece of engineering that would have taken any other species decades to develop. The Thessary Collective built 2,000 of them in 3 months, and the humans did what they had been doing from the beginning. They connected everything together, solved problems that fell between the gaps of other species' expertise, and found ways to make impossible things work. The coordination problem was the biggest challenge. How do you synchronize an attack across hundreds of light years when the speed of light itself creates communication delays of years? The Velthari suggested using their time manipulation technology to create a synchronized time field, but the distances involved were too great even for their advanced systems. The Luminari proposed using quantum entanglement for instant communication, but the bandwidth was too narrow to carry the detailed instructions each ship would need. It was a human named Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma who found the solution. Sharma was a navigation officer who had spent her career calculating jump trajectories for faster-than-light travel. She was not a physicist or an engineer. She was a mathematician, and she saw the synchronization problem not as a physics problem, but as a math problem. She proposed a system she called cascade timing. Instead of trying to synchronize all ships at once, she divided the attack into a sequence of waves, each triggered by the results of the previous wave. The first wave of ships would attack the outermost weak points and then emit a specific signal. The next wave, positioned closer to the center, would wait for that signal and then attack their targets. The third wave would wait for the second wave's signal, and so on, creating a cascade of attacks that rippled inward like a wave in a pond. Each wave would be timed so that all the disruptions reached their targets at exactly the right moment, accounting for distance, signal propagation, and the predicted behavior of the pattern. It was a brilliantly simple solution to an incredibly complex problem, and it was the kind of solution that could only come from a mind that was comfortable with imperfection. The cascade would not be perfectly synchronized. There would be small errors, tiny delays, moments where the timing was slightly off. A Velthari would have rejected the plan because it was not exact. A Thessari would have rejected it because it relied on probabilities rather than certainties. But Sharma was human, and humans had built their entire civilization on the principle that good enough now was better than perfect never. The Luminari chief analyst, Bright Echo, reviewed Sharma's calculations and expressed something that the translation system rendered as reluctant amazement. Bright Echo said that the plan should not work. The margins of error were too large, the variables too many, the risks too high. And yet, when Bright Echo ran the numbers through Luminary computational models, the probability of success was higher than any other proposed approach. Bright Echo asked Sharma how she had come up with such an unconventional solution. Sharma laughed and said that she had gotten the idea from watching rain fall on a lake when she was a child. Each raindrop created its own ripple, and the ripples interacted with each other in complex ways, but the overall pattern was always beautiful and always worked. The plan was approved. The operation was given a name that the humans chose and the other species accepted. They called it Operation Raindrop. Preparation took 4 months. 4 months of building weapons, positioning ships, training crews, running simulations, and solving the 1,000 small problems that arose every day. During those 4 months, the void wave continued to advance, consuming another 30 star systems and an estimated 2 billion sentient beings who had not been evacuated in time. Every death weighed on the people working in the Joint Operations Center, driving them to work harder, faster, with a desperation that burned like fuel. Chen spent those months shuttling between the Nexus and the various fleet staging areas, doing the political work that was necessary to keep the coalition together. Old rivalries between species threatened to fracture the alliance every few weeks. The Draconith and the Velthari nearly came to blows over a disagreement about fleet positioning. The Thessari Collective experienced a schism when a minority faction argued that evacuation was a better use of resources than attack. The Luminari became increasingly withdrawn as the stress of the situation pushed their crystalline bodies toward a state of dangerous instability. Each time a crack appeared in the alliance, Chen was there to fill it. She cajoled, she argued, she pleaded, she threatened when she had to. She reminded the Draconith that the Velthari had contributed technology without which the resonance disruptors could not function. She reminded the Velthari that the Draconith fleet was the backbone of the attack force. She told the Thessari dissidents that there was nowhere to evacuate to and that the only way to save their species was to fight. She spent hours with the Luminari ambassador, sitting in the darkened section of the council chamber, not talking, just being present, because she had learned that sometimes the Luminari needed silence more than words. She was exhausted. She was frightened. She was carrying a weight that no human being should have to carry. But she kept going, because that was what humans did. They kept going. The fleet assembled over 3 weeks, moving into position with a precision that would have been impossible without the combined efforts of every species in the Alliance. 12,000 ships from 5 civilizations, the largest military force ever gathered in galactic history, spread across a volume of space that would have taken light itself years to cross. Each ship carried a resonance disruptor and a crew that understood they might not survive what was coming. Each crew had been briefed on the plan, had run the simulations, had memorized their exact firing coordinates and timing sequences. The human ships were assigned to the most dangerous positions, the innermost ring of the cascade, where the pattern was strongest and the chances of survival were lowest. Chen had argued against this, saying that humans should not bear a disproportionate share of the risk. But it was the Draconith commander, Admiral Vex Krathis, who overruled her. Krathis was a grizzled veteran who had spent his entire career preparing for a battle that he had never expected to fight. He told Chen that the inner ring required crews who could adapt to unexpected conditions in real time, and no species in the galaxy could adapt faster than humans. It was not favoritism or sacrifice. It was tactical logic. Chen accepted the decision. She did not like it, but she accepted it, and then she did something that surprised everyone. She requested permission to join the fleet, not as a commander or a strategist, but as a crew member on one of the inner ring ships. She said that she could not ask others to take risks that she was not willing to take herself. Okafor, speaking via communication link from Earth, told her she was being foolish. She was too valuable as a diplomat and leader to risk on a military operation. Chen replied that if the operation failed, there would be nothing left to lead, and if it succeeded, she wanted to be able to look the families of the fallen in the eye and say that she had been there with their loved ones. Okafor was quiet for a long time. Then he gave his permission. He told her to come home safe. Chen was assigned to the human destroyer ASS Defiance, commanded by Captain Marcus Webb. Webb had been promoted after his service on the Magellan and given command of one of the newest ships in the human fleet. His crew was young, most of them volunteers who had joined the military specifically for this operation. They were scared. They did not hide it. But they were also determined, with the kind of quiet resolve that comes from knowing exactly what is at stake. The night before the operation, Chen walked through the ship, talking to crew members, learning their names, hearing their stories. She met a weapons officer from Lagos who had left her 2 children with her parents because she believed the galaxy was worth fighting for. She met an engineer from Buenos Aires who had designed part of the resonance disruptor system and wanted to see his work in action. She met a pilot from Osaka who had flown scout missions in the void and had come back with nightmares that woke her every night, but who had volunteered for this mission because she said the nightmares would be worse if she knew she had stayed safe while others fought. Chen listened to each of them and thanked them. She did not give speeches about glory or destiny or the human spirit. She simply told them that she was proud to serve with them and that whatever happened tomorrow, the galaxy would remember what they had done. Then she went to her assigned bunk, lay down in the narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. She did not think she could sleep ever again, but she closed her eyes and breathed, and she waited for the morning. Across the galaxy, 12,000 crews did the same thing. Draconith warriors meditated in the heat of their ships, centering themselves for battle. Luminary beings dimmed their light to a soft glow, conserving energy for the effort to come. Thesari collectives harmonized their minds, achieving a unity of purpose that was like a single note held by a million voices. Velthari commanders reviewed their plans one final time, their skin cycling through colors that reflected every emotion from fear to resolve. And humans drank coffee and told bad jokes and hugged each other and cried quietly in corners and wrote letters to people they loved and did all the messy, imperfect, deeply human things that other species found baffling but that kept the human soul intact in the face of oblivion. Morning came, though in space the concept of morning was arbitrary, just a number on a clock agreed upon by the fleet command. Admiral Krathis opened a communication channel to every ship in the fleet and spoke a single sentence in the Draconith language that the translation systems rendered into every language spoken by every crew. E said it was time. The outer ring fired first. 3,000 ships spread across an arc of space so vast that the entire human solar system could have been lost in it without being noticed, activated their resonance disruptors in a synchronized pulse that had been calculated down to the nanosecond. The energy they released was invisible to the naked eye but devastating at the quantum level. It tore into the weak points of the embedded pattern like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting the threads that connected the outer regions of the web to its core. The cascade had begun. The signal from the first ring reached the second ring 17 minutes later. 3,000 more ships fired, their disruptors targeting the next layer of weak points. Then the third ring. Then the fourth. The cascade rippled inward like Sharma had planned, like raindrops falling on a lake, each impact creating waves that reinforced the ones before it. And then the pattern began to fight back. Nobody had expected this. The models had predicted that the pattern would try to reroute and repair passive defenses, like a wound trying to heal. Instead, the pattern lashed out. Tendrils of distorted space-time whipped outward from the damaged regions, striking the nearest ships with a force that bent reality around them. Ships were crushed, not by physical force, but by the sudden compression of the space they occupied. Ships were flung across light years in an instant, emerging in random locations, with their crews dead or unconscious from the transition. Ships simply ceased to exist, erased from reality as completely as the stars the entity had consumed. The outer rings took heavy casualties. The Draconith flagship, a massive dreadnought that had been the pride of their fleet for centuries, was hit by a tendril that twisted its hull into a shape that should have been geometrically impossible. The crew survived because the Draconith were tough enough to endure forces that would have killed most other species, but the ship was crippled. A Velthari science vessel was thrown 12 light-years off course and emerged in the middle of an asteroid field. A Thessary engineering platform was torn in half, its crew spilling into space. The cascade faltered. Ships that were supposed to fire at precise moments hesitated as their crews witnessed the destruction around them. The timing began to drift, and Sharma's calculations, which depended on each wave triggering the next in a precise sequence, started to fall apart. In the Joint Operations Center, Vasquez watched the situation deteriorate on her displays and felt a cold weight settle in her chest. The plan was failing. The cascade was losing coherence, and without coherence, the disruptions would not reinforce each other. The pattern would repair itself, and everything they had sacrificed would be for nothing. She opened a communication channel to the inner ring, to the human ships that had not yet fired, and she said 5 words. She said they had to hold the line. On the ESS Defiance, Captain Webb heard the message and understood what it meant. The inner ring could not fire yet because the cascade had not reached them, but if they waited for the cascade, it might never come. The timing was broken. The outer rings were in chaos. The only way to save the operation was for the inner ring to fire early, on their own initiative, without the cascade's synchronization. It meant firing blind. It meant guessing the exact moment when their disruptions would overlap with whatever remained of the cascade. It meant accepting a probability of success that was measured in single-digit percentages. Webb looked at Chen, who was strapped into an observer's seat on the bridge. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. They both knew what had to be done. Webb opened a channel to the inner ring and gave the order. He told every ship to calculate their best firing solution based on what they could see of the cascade's progress, to adjust for the delays and the chaos, and to fire when they believed the moment was right, not when a computer told them. Not when a signal arrived. When they believed it, it was the most human thing he could have asked of them. Trust your instincts. Trust your gut. Trust the thing inside you that knows when to act, even when every rational analysis says the odds are impossible. The inner ring fired. The inner ring ships fired their resonance disruptors in a ragged, imperfect volley that bore no resemblance to the precisely coordinated cascade that Sharma had designed. Each crew fired when their captain judged the moment was right, relying on instinct and experience and the kind of desperate courage that only comes when there is no alternative. The timing was off. The targeting was approximate. The energy levels varied from ship to ship, depending on how much power their engineers had managed to squeeze from overtaxed systems. By every measurable standard, the inner ring's attack should have failed. The mathematics said so. The simulation said so. The Luminary computational models gave it a success probability of less than 4%. But the mathematics and the simulations and the computational models had all been built on the assumption that the cascade would either work perfectly or fail completely. None of them had accounted for what happened when 2,000 crews, each making independent decisions based on imperfect information, somehow managed to find a rhythm that was not planned but was felt, a collective intuition that emerged from the chaos like music from noise. The resonance disruptors hit the deepest weak points of the embedded pattern, and the effect was devastating. Not because the attack was precise, but because it was everywhere at once, coming from every direction, hitting targets that the pattern's defensive responses could not track, because there was no single point of origin, no organized formation, no predictable sequence. The pattern's tendrils lashed out, trying to strike back, but they found nothing to focus on. The inner ring ships were scattered, irregular, unpredictable, and the pattern, which had evolved to counter organized threats, could not adapt to their chaos quickly enough. The weak points shattered. The threads connecting the inner core of the embedded consciousness to its outer reaches snapped like overstretched wires. The pattern did not unravel gradually. It collapsed in a cascading failure that spread outward from the core at the speed of light. Each broken connection destabilizing the ones around it, each failure triggering 10 more failures, until the entire web that had been woven into the fabric of galactic spacetime began to tear itself apart. On the bridge of the ESS Defiance, the sensors registered the collapse as a wall of distorted spacetime rushing outward from the galactic core. Chen watched the display with her heart hammering against her ribs, not knowing whether what she was seeing was victory or a new form of destruction. Captain Webb gripped the arms of his command chair and ordered all hands to brace for impact. The crew held on to whatever was nearest, closing their eyes, clenching their teeth, preparing for the end. The wavefront hit the Defiance like a tsunami hitting a rowboat. The ship tumbled, its artificial gravity failing, its hull groaning under stresses it was never designed to endure. Chen was thrown against her restraints, the breath knocked out of her. Warning alarms screamed from every console. The lights went out, leaving only the emergency strips that cast the bridge in a dim red glow. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, the ship was tossed through distorted space like a leaf in a hurricane. Then it stopped. The turbulence faded. The ship stabilized. The alarms continued their shrieking until Webb silenced them with a voice that shook but did not break. The sensors came back online one by one, painting a picture of what had happened. The embedded pattern was gone. Not damaged, not disrupted, but completely gone. Erased from the fabric of space-time as thoroughly as the stars the entity had consumed. In its place was normal space, clean and empty, and operating according to the laws of physics that the universe had established 14 billion years ago. Chen stared at the sensor display and felt tears running down her face. She did not bother to wipe them away. Around her, the bridge crew was reacting in different ways. Some were cheering. Some were crying. Some were sitting in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. Webb had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and Chen could not tell if he was laughing or sobbing. She opened a communication channel to the Joint Operations Center and spoke 3 words that would become the most famous sentence in galactic history. She said that the pattern was down. The reaction across the fleet was immediate and overwhelming. Draconith warriors roared their triumph, a sound that shook the hulls of their ships. Luminary beings blazed with light so bright that it was visible across millions of kilometers. Thessari collectives harmonized in a frequency that represented pure, undiluted joy. Velfari commanders allowed their skin to shift through every color in the spectrum, a display of emotion that their culture normally forbade, but that no one could suppress in this moment. But the celebration was tempered by loss. The fleet had paid a terrible price. Of the 12,000 ships that had participated in Operation Raindrop, nearly 3,000 had been destroyed or disabled. The casualty count was still being compiled, but preliminary estimates put the dead at over 400,000 beings from every species in the Alliance. Entire ship crews had been wiped out. Veterans and volunteers and young recruits who had been alive that morning were gone, their lives traded for a chance at survival that had very nearly not materialized. The human losses were proportionally the highest. The inner ring, which had been staffed primarily by human crews, had taken the worst of the pattern's counterattack. Of the 800 human ships in the inner ring, only 462 survived. The rest were gone, their crews with them. Young men and women from every nation on Earth, people who had volunteered knowing the risks and gone anyway, erased from existence by forces that no human being should have had to face. Chen felt each loss like a physical blow. She had walked through the Defiance the night before the operation and looked into the faces of people who were now dead. She had learned their names, heard their reasons for volunteering, seen the photographs of families and lovers and children that they kept in their quarters. She carried those memories now, and she knew she would carry them for the rest of her life. But the embedded pattern was destroyed, and that meant the void entity had lost its advanced preparation. It was still coming, still consuming stars on the outer edge of the galaxy, but it was coming blind now. Without the embedded consciousness to guide it, without the alterations to space-time that would have made the galaxy easier to consume, the entity would have to do everything itself. And that, the scientists believed, would slow it down enough to give the Alliance time to develop a more permanent solution. The weeks following Operation Raindrop were a mixture of mourning and urgent work. Memorial services were held on every world in the Alliance, honoring the dead in ways that reflected each species' cultural traditions. The Draconith inscribed the names of their fallen warriors on the Wall of Eternity, a monument on their homeworld that recorded every warrior who had died in service to their people. The Luminari created a constellation of light, each point representing a lost being that hung in space near the Nexus as a permanent reminder. The Thessari incorporated the memories of their dead into the collective consciousness, ensuring that their contributions would never be forgotten. The Velthari held a silence, a period of 3 days during which no Velthari spoke, their grief expressed through the absence of their voices. The humans held funerals. Simple, emotional, deeply human funerals, where people gathered and cried and told stories about the dead and ate food that the deceased had loved and played music that had mattered to them. Chen attended as many as she could, standing among grieving families and offering what comfort she could, which was very little. She did not give speeches about sacrifice or glory. She simply said that she was sorry and that she would not forget. While the galaxy mourned, the scientists worked. The destruction of the embedded pattern had provided an enormous amount of data about the void entity, and research teams from every species were analyzing it around the clock. The Luminari led the effort, their understanding of physics providing the framework within which the other species' contributions could be organized. The key question was whether the entity could be stopped permanently. Destroying the embedded pattern had been a significant blow, but the main body of the entity was still approaching, still consuming stars, and still unimaginably vast. The most optimistic estimate suggested that the loss of the embedded pattern had slowed its advance by perhaps 40%, buying the galaxy years instead of months. But it was still coming, and eventually, it would arrive. It was during this period of intense research that the most important discovery of the entire crisis was made, and it was made not by a Luminari physicist or a Velthari elder, but by a human graduate student named Thomas Okonkwo. Okonkwo was 26 years old. He had been working on his doctoral thesis in theoretical physics at the University of Nairobi when the crisis began, and he had volunteered for the research effort because he could not imagine doing anything else while the galaxy was in danger. He had been assigned to a team analyzing the quantum foam data that Tanaka had collected during her missions in the void, and he had spent months studying patterns that most of his more experienced colleagues had already examined and dismissed as noise. But Okonkwo saw something in the noise that others had not. He noticed that the quantum foam fluctuations inside the void were not just organized by the entity's presence, but were being generated by it. The entity was not existing within spacetime. It was creating its own spacetime, a bubble of altered reality that expanded as it moved, overriding the normal universe with its own version of physics. This was a radical idea, and when Okonkwo presented it to his team, the reaction was skeptical. The Luminari scientists in particular found it difficult to accept because it contradicted their fundamental understanding of how the universe worked. Space-time was not something that could be created or overwritten. It was the stage on which reality played out, and the stage could not be replaced while the play was still running. Okonkwo did not argue. He simply showed them the data. And the data, once they looked at it with fresh eyes, was undeniable. The entity was not part of this universe. It came from somewhere else, a place with different physical laws, and it was converting the Milky Way's reality into its own reality as it advanced. The consumed stars were not destroyed. They were transformed, changed into something that obeyed different rules, something that was still there but was no longer part of this universe. This discovery changed everything because it implied something extraordinary. If the entity was converting the universe rather than destroying it, then the conversion might be reversible. And if it was reversible, then the entity could not just be slowed or stopped. It could be pushed back. Its changes could be undone. The consumed stars could, theoretically, be restored. The question was how. Converting reality back to its original state would require an energy source of unimaginable power, directed with impossible precision, applied across an area of space so vast that even thinking about it made the mind reel. The Velthari Elder Solmeth was the one who identified the potential energy source. The neutron star at the center of the galaxy, the One, the Nexus station orbited, was not just any neutron star, it was a magnetar. A neutron star with a magnetic field so powerful that it could strip the electron shells from atoms at a distance of thousands of kilometers. If that magnetic field could be channeled and focused, it might provide enough energy to reverse the entity's conversion process. The Thessary engineers calculated the requirements and determined that channeling the magnetar's energy would require a structure larger than anything ever built. A focusing array that would encircle the neutron star completely. Building it would take every resource the Alliance had and would leave nothing in reserve. If it worked, the entity would be pushed back and the galaxy would be saved. If it failed, the Alliance would have exhausted its resources and would be defenseless when the entity arrived. It was the biggest gamble in the history of civilization. And it was Chen who made the argument that convinced the council to take it. She stood in the council chamber one final time, looking up at the representatives of species that she had come to know, to respect, and in some cases to love. Kratos, the warrior who had been the first to support her when she proposed the Joint Operations Center. Bright Echo, the Luminari analyst who had become one of her closest advisors. The Thessary Collective, whose inhuman efficiency hid a capacity for loyalty that had surprised her, and Solmeth, the ancient Velthari who had watched Chen grow from a nervous young ambassador into someone who could stand before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and speak without flinching. She told them that she understood the risk. She told them that failure would mean the end of everything, that there would be no second chance, no fallback plan, no place to retreat to. She told them that the mathematics were uncertain, the engineering was untested, and the outcome was impossible to predict. And then she told them that uncertainty was not a reason to do nothing. She told them that her species had a history of making impossible choices in impossible situations and finding ways to survive that no one had predicted. She told them that humans had crossed oceans in wooden boats, had split the atom with hand-built machines, had reached the stars with technology that the Velthari would have considered barely functional, not because they were the smartest or the strongest or the most advanced, but because they refused to accept that something could not be done simply because it had never been done before. She told them that the galaxy had 12,000 years of peace and prosperity behind it, 12,000 years of achievement and discovery and creation. She asked if they were willing to let all of that disappear because they were afraid to take a risk. The council voted. It was unanimous. Construction of the focusing array began immediately. The Thessaly collectives, working with a speed and precision that astonished even those who knew them well, built the structural framework. The Velthari provided the technology to channel and direct the Magnetar's energy. The Luminari calibrated the targeting systems with a level of accuracy that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. The Draconith fleet provided security, patrolling the construction zone against the tendrils of distorted spacetime that the entity occasionally sent probing inward. And the humans did everything else. They ferried supplies, coordinated schedules, solved problems, filled gaps, and kept the whole enormous project moving forward through sheer stubborn refusal to let it fail. When a critical component of the focusing array proved impossible to manufacture with existing technology, a human engineer named Rosa Gutierrez invented a new manufacturing process in 3 days flat. When a scheduling conflict between Velthari and Draconith work crews threatened to delay construction by weeks, a human logistics officer named J. Park redesigned the entire work schedule overnight, finding efficiencies that the Thessaly collective had missed. When morale faltered, as it did repeatedly in the face of the enormous task and the ever-present knowledge that the void wave was still approaching, it was the humans who organized the gatherings, the meals, the celebrations of small victories that kept spirits alive. The array was completed in 7 months. It encircled the Magnetar in a ring of technology that combined the achievements of 5 civilizations into a single structure of breathtaking complexity and beauty. When it was activated for testing, the energy it focused was so intense that sensors across the galaxy detected it. The full activation was scheduled for a date that the humans called a Tuesday, though the significance of this was lost on the other species. Every ship in the Alliance fleet was cleared from the area around the Magnetar. Every sensor in the galaxy was pointed at the void wave. Every being in the Alliance, from the highest ambassador to the lowliest maintenance worker, held their breath. Chen was on the Nexus station, standing in the council chamber with the other ambassadors. She had argued to be on the array itself, to be present at the moment of activation. But Solmeth had talked her out of it with a gentleness that was uncharacteristic for the normally formal Velthari. He told her that she had done enough. He told her that her place was here, with the Council, where her courage had held the Alliance together through its darkest moments. The activation command was given by Admiral Krathis, who spoke a single word in the Draconith language. The word meant begin, but it also meant believe. The focusing array ignited. The Magnetar's energy, channeled and focused by the greatest engineering achievement in galactic history, shot outward in a beam that was invisible to the naked eye, but that burned in every sensor like a new star being born. The beam struck the edge of the void wave, and the effect was immediate. The converted spacetime began to revert, the entity's version of reality peeling back like a mask being removed, revealing the original universe underneath. Stars reappeared, not all at once, but one by one, flickering back into existence like candles being relit in a dark room. Each one was exactly as it had been before the entity consumed it, its planets intact, its systems unchanged, as if the entity had merely hidden them, rather than destroying them. The void wave retreated, not slowly, not gradually, but in a rush, pulling back from the galaxy like a tide going out. The entity recoiled from the beam, its vast consciousness registering something it had perhaps never experienced before. Pain, not physical pain, but the pain of having its changes undone, its work reversed, its hunger denied. It pulled back, and back, and back, retreating toward the edge of the galaxy and beyond, retreating into the space between galaxies where the beam could not reach. In the council chamber, the displays showed the void wave contracting, the galaxy reclaiming its lost territory system by system, star by star. The room erupted in a celebration that crossed every cultural boundary. Kratos lifted Chen off her feet in a hug that would have broken her bones if he had not been careful. Bright echo blazed so brilliantly that the entire chamber was bathed in light. The Thessery Collective produced a sound that was not just happiness, but something deeper. A recognition that the work of millions had produced a result worth every sacrifice. Solmeth stood apart from the celebration, his skin cycling through colors that Chen had never seen before. When she approached him, he looked at her with eyes that had seen 12,000 years of galactic history, and he spoke in a voice that trembled with an emotion she could not name. He told her that in all his long life he had never witnessed anything like what humanity had done. Not the technology, not the military operation, not the scientific discoveries. Those were impressive, yes, but other species could have achieved them given enough time. What Solmeth had never seen before was the quality that made everything else possible. The quality that drove humans to volunteer for missions they knew they might not survive. The quality that made a graduate student look at data that experts had dismissed and see what they could not. The quality that made an ambassador stand before ancient beings and demand that they fight for their lives. He said the Velthari had a word for it. A word so old that most Velthari had forgotten it. The word meant the fire that burns inside a being who knows they are mortal, the fierce brightness of a life that knows it will end. The Velthari had lost that fire long ago, somewhere in the millennia of their existence, when their lives grew so long that death became an abstraction rather than a reality. They had traded urgency for patience, passion for wisdom, fire for calm. He told Chen that humanity had reminded the galaxy what it meant to be alive, not the Velthari kind of being alive, which was measured and careful and very, very long, but the human kind of being alive, which was messy and loud and painful and short and burned so bright that it lit up everything around it. Chen did not know what to say, so she did something that was very human and not at all diplomatic. She took the ancient Velthari's hand, a being who had been alive since before humans had discovered fire, and she held it. And Solmeth, who had not been touched by another being in over a century, held her hand back. The entity did not return. The focusing array remained active, a permanent deterrent against any future approach. The alliance, forged in crisis, continued in peace, but it was a different kind of peace than the galaxy had known before. It was not the comfortable, complacent peace of species that had forgotten what it meant to struggle. It was a peace that had been earned, fought for, and paid for in blood and tears and the lives of 400,000 brave beings who had stood between the galaxy and oblivion. Humanity's place in the galactic community changed forever. They were no longer the youngest, weakest, least advanced species. They were still young, still relatively weak, still technologically behind their allies, but they were respected now, not with the condescending respect that the old give to the young, but with the deep, genuine respect that warriors give to fellow warriors, that scholars give to fellow scholars, that beings who have faced death together give to each other. Chen served as ambassador for another 20 years before retiring to a small house on the coast of Japan, where she spent her remaining decades watching the ocean and answering letters from beings all over the galaxy who wanted to tell her what humanity's courage had meant to them. Reyes and Tanaka and Webb returned to exploring the galaxy, their little ship, the Magellan, becoming the most famous vessel in human history. Sharma was offered positions at every university in the galaxy and accepted a post at a Luminary Academy, where she spent the rest of her career teaching mathematics to beings who were, she often said with a smile, much smarter than her but not nearly as stubborn. Oko won every scientific prize the galaxy had to offer and used his fame to establish research programs that brought young scientists from every species together, because he believed that the next great discovery would come not from any single mind, but from the collision of different ways of thinking. And on the Wall of Eternity, on the Draconith homeworld, alongside the names of Draconith warriors who had fallen in 10,000 years of battles, a new section was carved. It was dedicated to the humans and the beings of every species who had died in Operation Raindrop, and at its top, in letters that would endure as long as the stone they were carved in, was a single sentence in the human language that had become the motto of the Alliance. The sentence was simple. It was not poetic or profound or elegant. It was, like the species that had spoken it, rough and direct and utterly without pretension. It said that when the darkness came, they chose to be the light, and that was enough. That was everything.